Chapter 14 Immortal November 28th, 1930. The scientist who stood to meet Charles Lindbergh in the dining room of the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research in Manhattan was a foot shorter than the pilot. He was stocky and pink-cheeked, and his eyes, one blue, the other brown, peered up through his pince-nez. As he scanned Charles's face, he didn't say a word. Besides being a Nobel laureate and experimental surgeon, Dr. Alexis Carroll was a practitioner of physiognomy. That is, he believed the quality of a man's soul could be read on his face, imprinted there, he claimed, by brain waves controlling the facial muscles. If Dr. Carroll's scrutiny of someone left him with a good impression, the doctor would talk freely. If not, he would shrug and turn away. He took to Charles instantly, and the pilot, who rarely warmed up to people quickly, had a similar response to Dr. Carroll. When they shook hands, claimed Charles, an electrical current passed between them. Carroll described it as being linked by strong psychic bonds. Over tea and sandwiches, Charles explained to Carroll why he'd come. Months earlier, Charles's sister-in-law, Elizabeth, had suffered a mild heart attack. The doctor's prognosis was grim. The 26-year-old had lesions on her heart valves that would only worsen with time. He doubted she'd live long. Charles was puzzled. Why couldn't the doctor just operate and remove the lesions? Elizabeth's doctor had explained that the heart could not be stopped long enough for the surgery to be performed. Blood, he explained, had to be kept circulating through the body. Charles persisted. Wasn't the heart simply a pump? It seemed as though it should be quite simple to design a mechanical pump capable of circulating blood through a body during the short period required for an operation. Why hadn't one been invented? The doctor didn't know. Charles had been taken aback. Could it be that no one had seriously thought of designing a mechanical heart for use in surgery? He wondered. He hadn't forgotten what he'd said to Donald Kehoe years earlier. He still wanted to work on scientific problems. He still wanted to explore the possibility of immortality. And the idea of a mechanical heart seemed a good place to start. His mind tumbled with exciting possibilities. Why could not a part of the body be kept alive indefinitely if a mechanical heart was attached to it, an arm, or even a head? Why could not the entire body be kept alive after the heart it was born with became too old and worn out to function? Charles had posed these questions to the anesthesiologist who attended Anne during the baby's birth. The anesthesiologist didn't have an answer either, but he could send the pilot to someone who did know, Dr. Alexis Carroll. This was the reason Charles sat across from Carroll now. Patiently, Dr. Carroll answered all Charles's questions. No, he said, a mechanical heart made of glass or metal could not be used to circulate blood through the body, while surgeons operated on Elizabeth Morrow because blood soon coagulates, solidifies in contact with surfaces of glass or metal. However, he added, he was working on something the pilot might find interesting. If you like, I will show you what we are doing here, he said. The laboratory of Dr. Carroll. Charles and Dr. Carroll climbed a spiral staircase to the 5th floor to a lab few scientists at the Institute knew about. Tucked beneath the attic eaves, it was hidden away from general view, and despite the hefty sums spent by administrators to fund the experiments going on there, it had remained largely a secret. But now, taken with Charles Lindbergh, Dr. Carroll was eager to reveal its mysteries. Upstairs, the scientist asked his guest to change into a black surgical robe and cap. The color surprised Charles. Patiently, Carroll explained his belief that black was more antiseptic than white. For this reason, every surface in his 4 operating rooms was also black. He used to criticism. He was used to criticism. He knew some people found this eccentric, but he didn't care. He was used to criticism from the scientific community, especially in recent years as his experiments strayed from the objective, rational science of medicine to what he called metaphysical researches, clairvoyance, miracle healings, hypnotism, his experiments, remarked one of Dr. Carroll's colleagues, were a cross between medieval alchemy and the weird experiments of Dr. Frankenstein. He led Charles into the animal rooms. Here, said Dr. Carroll, were his patients, dogs and cats inside cages, some with open sores on their backs. Carroll explained his search for substances that healed wounds quickly and without infection. A discovery like that, he noted, would save millions of human lives. As for the animals' whimpering and moaning, it didn't bother him. The advancement of science, he believed, required their sacrifice. To learn how man and animals live, we cannot avoid seeing them die. Dr. Carroll liked to say. Next, he led his guest down the hall to a large glass-walled structure filled with hundreds of boxes and soil-filled pens. This was Dr. Carroll's mausoleum. Charles stared, transfixed, despite its nose-wrinkling stench. 14,000 mice, a city of rodents, scratched through dirt, gnawed on cage bars, hissed, rested, fought, ate, groomed, and gave birth. Some looked sleek and fat, their fur silky, and their eyes bright. Others, covered with scars and wounds, cowered nervously in tunnels or hid beneath sawdust bedding. With their sharp yellow teeth, bigger mice slashed at smaller ones. There were squeals of fear and pain. There was blood. The mausoleum's purpose was to recreate real life and the struggle for existence. Dr. Carroll would later explain. Seeing the strongest dominate and kill the weakest was merely to observe what was right and natural. Here was the pure mechanism of natural selection at work. The fit eliminated the unfit. Or, put another way, the strong and intelligent procreated and the weak died without coddling. This was how superior civilizations developed, he claimed. The men at last turned away. With the odor of blood and fear still thick in his nostrils, Charles followed Carroll into a microscope-lined laboratory. The scientist opened a refrigerator door to reveal bits and pieces of tissue. He held up a glass container. A cat thyroid, he said, identifying the thumb-sized organ within. He went on to explain his interest in attaching the parts of one animal to another of the same species. He'd first tried this 25 years ago when he'd attached a puppy's kidney to the carotid artery of an adult dog. To Carol's amazement, the kidney had functioned normally for several hours. Sadly, other such attempts had not been so successful. Still, he held out hope, especially for skin grafting. The next room was in the incubator room. The next room was the incubator room. Warm and moist, thanks to steam jets in the walls. This room was where Dr. Carroll kept microscopic pieces of tissue alive. Some from laboratory animals, some from humans. Dozens of culture flasks lined the counter, but his most famous experiment sat on a table all by itself. On January 17th, 1921, Carroll had taken a minute sample of heart muscle from a chicken embryo and placed it in a flask containing nutrient fluid. Within 2 days, the tissue sample had doubled in size. Within 4 days, it had grown to 4 times its original size. Now, 18 years later, the embryo tissue was still alive and still growing. Every January 17th, Dr. Carroll's staff gathered around to sing happy birthday to it. As Charles peered through a microscope at the chicken embryo tissue, his mind took a leap. If this tissue could survive for years, why not entire organs? She could survive for years. Why not entire organs? He asked Carol. Could they be kept alive outside the body too? Charles's perceptivity startled Dr. Carroll. He'd been wrestling with the same question for the past 10 years. He opened a cabinet and showed his guest a collection of variously designed devices called perfusion pumps. Built to the doctor's specifications, each was meant to keep organs living outside the body, but each had failed. Keeping an organ alive after its removal from the body was far more difficult than sustaining embryo tissue, Carl explained. Organs remained alive only if they were perfused, that is, supplied with a steady stream of nutrients and oxygenated blood. The doctor had already perfected a synthetic substitute for the body's natural fluids. What he needed was a way to properly circulate his fluid around the organ. How could he experiment on living organs if he could not find a way to keep them alive for a prolonged period? There was no telling what medical advances might be possible if he could. Dying organs might be removed from the body and placed in the pump, he said, to be revived and repaired and returned and to function once more. Charles looked over the collection of perfusion pumps. He thought the designs crude and said so. Matter-of-factly, he told the doctor he could improve on them. Then go ahead, replied Dr. Carroll. He offered Charles full use of his facilities. It was an astounding opportunity for a man barely who'd barely finished high school and flunked out of college. The chance to work alongside a Nobel Prize winning scientist in a world-class research facility. Charles immediately accepted the mystical and scientific meet. While working at the Rockefeller Institute, Charles must have recalled his grandfather Land's words. Science is a key to all mystery. With this key, man can become like a god himself. Charles already felt pretty godlike. The supreme confidence he'd exhibited as a child had only multiplied in the years since he'd taken up flying. He'd done something many thought impossible. His abilities seemed limitless. If anyone could unlock the mysteries of life and death, he believed he could. But accomplishment did not come without work. To become a full partner in this quest, he needed to take part in all Carroll's experiments, understand every procedure, and so he began, putting in long hours at the lab, skipping lunch and often leaving past midnight. He used his 2-hour commute for contemplating the phenomenon and rationality of death. In the incubator room, a textbook at his elbow, he peered for hours through the microscope at young and pulsing cells. Was it possible that with proper care they could live and pulse forever? He even examined his own sperm, marveling at the sight. Each one of them, my life's dream, he exclaimed, capable of spreading my existence throughout the human race, of reincarnating me in all eternity. While his work with the microscope forced him to contemplate cellular immortality, his time in the operating room led him to question the border between life and death. Here in the eerie, closed-off world of darkness and silence, Charles felt the mystical and the scientific meet. Everything in the room was black. The floors, the windowless walls, the operating table. Only the beams from the surgical light overhead and Dr. Carroll's white cap to distinguish him from his black-clad assistants broke the gloom. The animal on the operating table brought my eyes to focus on elements of life: breathing lungs, pulsing arteries, glistening skin, seeping red blood, recalled Charles. Life sometimes merged with death so closely I could not tell them apart. Click of scissors, cleave of scalpel, The surgeon's nimble fingers tying knots in silk, black figures manipulating flesh and organs, pres- preserving them, fragmenting them, trying to learn life's limits and capabilities. And when did and life end and death begin? Carol's scalpel might have killed the cat on the table, but parts of its body remained alive. A piece of its carotid artery, a major blood vessel found in the neck, refrigerated in petroleum jelly just above freezing, would go on functioning for months. The white blood cells being drawn from its body with a glass tube called a cannula would continue to thrive in petri dishes. So why couldn't entire organs live likewise? If I could design a better perfusion pump, Charles told himself, I could keep these organs alive long after the body had entered the state called death. At his workbench, he drew and redrew plans for his perfusion pump. Within weeks, he had an idea for a simple enclosed spiral glass device with two chambers, one for the liquid nutrient and the other for oxygen. When the device was placed on a motorized base that gently rocked back and forth, the fluids inside would mix and perfuse the organ. In March 1931, Charles passed the design on to the Institute's glass blower, and within weeks the men had a Pyrex perfusion pump. Dr. Carroll took a piece of a chicken's carotid artery and inserted it into the device's organ chamber. To their delight, the artery survived for days without infection. But it wasn't good enough. Success required that it survive for months, even years. Charles went back to drawing the board. He made one unsatisfactory model after another. Carroll, for his part, put each device to the test. The scientist was highly impressed with his protege. Despite the failures, Charles, he claimed, was original in his ideas, skilled with his hands, utterly dedicated to his work, and persistent. Stubbornly persistent. He wished he could tell people outside the Institute about Lindbergh, but he'd promised Charles he wouldn't whisper a word about the pilots working in the lab. And Dr. Carroll was very good at keeping secrets. The perfection of mankind. Secretive though he was, Dr. Carroll was a dazzling talker. He could spin theories as fast as he could construct sentences, and he cited all sorts of weird and obscure data to back up his beliefs. In an hour's lunchtime, he might bloviate about the difficulty of teaching to a camel to walk backwards. Dif- Difficulty of teaching a camel to walk backwards. Discuss the relative intelligence of dogs and monkeys, or give a long-winded account of a French peasant hypnotizing animals. He was also outspoken and definite when it came to his opinions about genetics, ethics, race, and biology. The white race is drowning in a sea of inferiors. There is no escaping that men are definitely not created equal, despite what democracy says. Instead of encouraging the survival of the unfit and the defective, we must help the strong. Only the elite makes the progress of the masses possible. Dr. Carroll must Dr. Carroll mused on sunlight's effect on race. We must not forget that most highly civilized races, the Scandinavians, for example, are white and have lived for many generations in a country where sunlight is weak during a great part of the year. The lower races generally inhabit countries where light is violent and the temperature warm. He riffed on race purification. Perhaps it would be effective to kill off the worst of us and keep the best, as we do in the breeding of dogs. And once he provided what he believed was a reasonable and unsentimental approach to solving society's ills. Those who have murdered, robbed, while armed, kidnapped children, despoiled the poor of their savings, or misled the public in important matters should be humanely and economically disposed of in small euthanasia institutions supplied with proper gases. Carroll often pointed to his Mausery to underscore his opinions. While the deaths of the weak might seemed cruel, they were necessary. He said, "Culling the weak moved the species generation by generation, closer to genetic perfection. And perfection of mankind was Carroll's most important scientific goal. This could only be achieved, he insisted, through eugenics. Charles, had already viewed eugenics favorably. Hadn't he practiced the pseudo-science when choosing a wife? But Carroll wasn't advocating the run-of-the-mill brand of eugenics so many upper middle class white Americans believed in. His was a radical brand widely disregarded by the scientific community that openly endorsed imprisonment and euthanasia. Why preserve useless and harmful human beings, he asked. He even floated the idea of culling human babies like puppies. These harsh measures, he insisted, were the only way to guarantee that white civilization would prevail. Leaning in and listening closely, Charles learned from his mentor and his academically untrained mind filled with radical theories about the improvement of the white race. Still flying, Anne was reluctant to go. I would have been content to stay home and do nothing else but care for my baby, she wrote in the spring of 1931. Despite his absorbing work at the Rockefeller Institute, Charles was planning another flying adventure, finding the shortest route from New York to Japan to link the countries by air, and he expected Anne to take her place as his crew member when he took off in July. Torn between motherhood and her husband, Anne found that her devotion to Charles eventually won out. Oh, how she loved her Lindy, recalled the baby's nurse, Betty Gow. She'd have gone anywhere and done anything for him, even leave that beautiful little baby behind. And little Charlie was beautiful, with his silky golden hair and enormous blue eyes. Sometimes Anne turned up the radio and danced through the house with him. She adored his scrunched up smile and the way he held out his pudgy hands for his toy lamb, then strangles it affectionately around the neck, playing patty cake and piggy toes. She could not have imagined such joy as this with Charlie. Silky golden hair and enormous blue eyes. Sometimes Anne turned up the radio and danced through the house with him. She adored his scrunched up smile and the way he held out his pudgy hands for his toy lamb, then strangles it affectionately around the neck, playing patty cake and piggy toes. She could not have imagined such joy as this with Charlie. In May, when Charlie was 11 months old, she noted with special pleasure how the baby used his father's knees to pull himself up, said Anne. Charles Sr. begins to be interested in him. It wasn't that Charles didn't love his son, but he believed in a more detached approach to fatherhood. Children should not be coddled, he insisted. On July 30th, 1931, Anne climbed into the cockpit of their black Lockheed Sirius seaplane and waved to the little boy in his nurse's arms. Charlie chirped bye-bye, his fingers curling. He was Betty Gow's baby now, along with he was Betty Gow's baby now, along with Betty Morrow. She would keep him safe until his parents' return. The Lindberghs flew across Canada, slipping through cloud banks that hovered over the Arctic ice pack and landing in out of the way places with names like Moose Factory and Aklavik in the Northwest Territories. After piloting through a lashing rainstorm, they arrived in Point Barrow, Alaska, where they joined the entire town in a potluck dinner of reindeer meat, wild goose, and canned celery. From there, they flew to Nome before crossing the Bering Sea to the Russian island of Kamchatka. It took expert flying through thick fog to get them to their next destination, Hokkaido, Japan. But they didn't stop to rest. On they pushed to Tokyo, arriving 1 month after they'd left the United States. For the next 2 weeks, there were bouquets, cameras, reporters, crowds. Charles inspected Japanese air bases and attended tea ceremonies, and in mid-September they pointed their plane toward China. All the while Anne missed the baby. She dreamed about him almost every night, but she didn't say a word to Charles. It seemed like such poor sportsmanship when this is a marvelous experience, she said. Back at the Morrow estate, Charlie crawled over the lawn with his blocks and played with the dogs. He stuck close to his Grandma Bee and Betty Gow, who sang to him and read him stories. He got his first haircut, too. Grandma Bee saved every snip of gold. Happy and well loved, he called his nurse and his grandmother Mummy. In China, Charles decided to fly home by way of Africa and South America around a route that would add another 6 weeks to their trip. Anne, who had her heart set on being home by October, couldn't bring herself to argue with her husband, but secretly she kept asking, "When will we get home?" The answer came unexpectedly and unhappily on October 5th. Anne received a telegram from her sister Elizabeth. Their father, Dwight, had died in his sleep from a stroke. Charles immediately canceled their plans. After crafting their plane, they took the first ship back to the United States. 19 days later, they arrived in New Jersey. Despite the loss of her father, Anne was glad to be home. "And oh, the baby," she gushed. "He is a boy, a strong, independent boy swaggering around on his firm little legs." Charlie did not recognize his parents, but he didn't act afraid when they swooped down on him. Charles was pleased by his 16-month-old's lack of fear. He couldn't conceive of his son being anything less than confident, bold, and independent. he began to take such an interest in the baby, exclaimed Anne, spoiling him by giving him cornflakes and toast and sugar and jam off his plate in the morning. Playing a game called Ceiling Flying, Charles tossed the boy into the air. Dan! Again! Screeched the toddler, arms outstretched. The boy admitted Charles was good looking and pretty interesting. Life settled down. As the house they were having built neared completion, they began spending weekends there, sitting with Charlie on the terrace. Anne imagined the flowers she would paint in the spring. Charles returned to his work with Dr. Carroll, with occasional side trips for TAT and Pan Am. He looked forward to seeing his son at the end of his workday. "Hi, Buster," he would call whenever he saw Charlie. "Hi, hi!" The toddler would happily screech back, and Anne nestled back into being a full-time mother. By February, her son was calling her Mummy again.